here we are. We're going to go straight into the science. So I'm going to hand over to Alex de Koning, who's a PhD student, who is going to take us through the science of the unfolding catastrophe that we're currently experiencing.
Thank you very much, Talia, and thank you all for coming. I appreciate you taking time out of your day in order to listen to us talk. So just as introduction, as Talia said, my name's Alex. I'm a 24-year-old PhD student studying green hydrogen production, and I joined Just Stop Oil in about mid-March. I had never been to a protest before, but what I learned, what I'm going to tell you today, it changed my life. And upon hearing it, I felt like I needed to do something. I needed to act in whatever way I could. So 2 weeks later, I ran in front of a moving oil tanker and sat down for 14 hours waiting to get arrested. What I'm going to tell you is it's all things that you can find online on very public information, but it's hard to hear. But I think just like when a doctor tells you that you have cancer, it's important for you to hear it, no matter how uncomfortable it is. There's no point skirting around the issue and making it worse. So I'm going to start with the climate change report. I'm sure you've all heard of this. It's ratified by 108 of the top countries and got thousands upon thousands of scientists working and reviewing thousands upon thousands of peer-reviewed reports. And their final line of their last report was, any further delay in concerted anticipatory global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. Those are powerful words. And you may ask yourself what that means, what a brief and rapidly closing window means. A lot of people said 1.5 degrees was that closing window where millions of people would die. I'm going to rip the Band-Aid off now and say that 1.5 degrees we're probably going to pass next year. It's locked in. It's been locked in since 2015, since the Paris Agreement, because that's how the climate works. It takes time for it to react to the situation we're in. We're facing this catastrophe now. It's as simple as that. And I don't want to talk about bullshit targets like 1.5 and 2. I want to talk about what this really means, the suffering that's happening because of this. Because last summer, we faced a heat wave here that was unprecedented in Europe. Global food, continental food shortages. We cannot face another summer like that. But every summer, this is going to get worse. Every year, this is going to get worse. More and more food failures. Already in the UK, we're facing food shortages, and it is February. Can we really face another summer where we have to put out wildfires with liquid manure because we're running out of water? Can we face another summer where farmers because they can no longer grow crops? We need food to survive. It's as simple as that. I'm going to read to you a passage from an article that came out this summer. It starts by saying, my friend has a niece. She's all of 5 years old, a bright and curious and intelligent little girl, an observant one. One day recently, the niece asked her mother a question she began to ask over and over. Mummy, where's the monster? At first, her mum dismissed the question. Kids will be kids. They ask all kinds of strange and funny and sometimes jarring questions. But the daughter kept asking. She'd frown, scrunch up her little face. There was something happening in her tiny world which was out of place. She didn't understand something was wrong, unnatural. She needed her mummy, her rock, her guiding light to give her an explanation. So she, and the determined way little kids of a certain kind can be, wouldn't take silence or refusal or dismissal or denial for an answer. Again and again, Mommy, where's the monster? This went on for a whole week. And finally, wondering if something was really wrong with her daughter, her mother asked in a combination of exasperation and concern, Darling, there is no monster. Monsters aren't real. You know that. Everything's fine. What makes you think there's a monster? What monster? Monster that's killing all the birds, Mummy. You see, this happened during the India and Pakistan heat wave, where it was so hot that birds were literally falling out of the sky. I can't imagine a more apocalyptic image than birds falling out of the sky. And I can't imagine having to explain to my child of what's happening in the world with the climate crisis and saying that we've known about it for the last 50 years. I never want to be in that situation. I never want anyone else to be in that situation. But the way we're going is predicted that in just 7 years' time, the vast majority of countries are going to have a similar such heat wave every second year. How do you grow food there? How do you even have water? Because of that, in just 7 years' time, it's predicted that 700 million people in Africa could be displaced, losing their homes, their livelihoods, their communities. 700 million people. The Ukraine refugee crisis is about 7 million people, and it's one of the worst that there's ever been in recent times. And yet, it gets worse because we're facing these climate change tipping points, these feedback loops, where because you have a drought, the land becomes drier. It's easier for wildfires to happen. Because the wildfire happens, the carbon dioxide that's captured in those trees is released and it can't capture any more carbon dioxide in the future. Those wildfires produce more atmospheric carbon dioxide, which produces more droughts, more wildfires, more droughts, more wildfires. And you end up in this horrible situation where you can't even put the wildfires out. Let's talk about some of the other tipping points, though, which are going to make this worse. There is a lot of energy required to melt ice. And when you run out of ice, you start heating the land instead. You're baking the land, making it even harder to grow crops. When that ice melts, all the trapped methane that's there is released. That's 84 times more polluting than carbon dioxide on a short-term basis. 84 times. And lastly, the one that's most terrifying, I mean, I can go on about climate change tipping points all day, but I just wanted to focus on 3 in case you didn't know them. The last one is the rainforests. What happens when rainforests can no longer sustain rainforest conditions? You see, they generate their own rainfall. And if that gets tipped out of place, the entire rainforest could die within a few years. As simple as that. The Amazon rainforest, which is twice the size of India, die in a few years with all that carbon dioxide released. Talked about 2030, 7 years' time. What happens beyond that? What about all of our net zero by 2050 targets? That's firstly, they're all bullshit. Secondly, currently we only have 1% of land mass that's unlivable temperatures, right? It's predicted that if we get to about 2 degrees by 2070, that could increase to 19%. The rainforest, Mexico, the majority of Africa, and India, Indonesia, top parts of Australia. That's where 3.5 billion people live. That'll be a third of our population living in places where it is too hot to live in about 40 years' time. Some say that could even happen earlier if we're continuing at this rate. We all know what happens when there's too many people who are displaced. It causes conflict, people fighting over food. It is horrible. I don't want to live to see a world where we're going to have far more conflict than we already have. You don't want to see that either. But I'm not only going to talk about how bad things are going to get, I'm also going to talk about the hope, except you know where the hope is. We've all known for decades, since solar, wind, tidal, wave, renewable energies that are currently 9 times cheaper, and still we're not switching to them. We have so many solutions there: insulation, cheaper public transport, energy for all at a basic level. I don't need to spend the entire time telling you about the solutions of the climate crisis. Instead, I want to talk about not where's the hope, but where's the monster. You see, that little girl in Pakistan, that 5-year-old, she couldn't imagine that there was something that was killing all of these birds, the heat that was causing them to die from dehydration and fall out of the sky. She had to create a fictional monster in order to wrap her head around that. But except, what if that monster's not fictional? What if that monster is the people who are opening up over 100 new oil and gas licenses in this country? What if the monsters are the people who are instead of taxing these oil and gas companies, making loopholes and basically giving them £22 billion, despite them already having more money than they know what to do with. I cannot even begin to describe this. What if the monster are the people who are on track to spend $103 million a day for the rest of the decade to exploit all new oil and gas? What if the monsters are the oil companies that are hosting COP28? We're putting a fox in charge of the henhouse right when we're on the verge of all these climate tipping points. We're jumping off a cliff and hoping somebody that is going to invent some technology to send a parachute to us. Where's the monster? What if the monster is the people who are silencing anyone from talking about the climate crisis, knowing this? David Nixon is a friend of mine. He got sentenced for 8 weeks in prison for mentioning the climate crisis in one of his trials, for talking about his motivation for doing a protest. Maybe the monster is the people who were found to be behaving illegally and then just a few months later opened up a new coal mine, the first one in 30 years. Well, the monsters are the people who have been knowing about the climate crisis for the last 50 years and continually make it worse. I'm going to read to you a quote. Climate activists are sometimes depicted as dangerous radicals, but the truly dangerous radicals are the countries that are increasing the production of fossil fuels. Investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure is moral and economic madness. That was said by the head of the UN. The head of the UN is saying we have our foot on the accelerator, we have our foot on the pedal towards climate hell, and we're accelerating. We need to make change. And you see, the thing is, we can. If we treated it like the emergency it is, we would make terrific progress. For example, when we were all going into lockdown, we all hated it, but we all did it. And the reason why that happened is because we had blanket coverage in the media. Every single day, it was being reported on. We knew it was an emergency, we hated it, but we did it anyway. When we put the money and the time in the right places, we can do amazing things as a society. Normally, it takes 10 to 15 years to make a vaccine for something. But because it was a global emergency, we made 3 vaccines in less than a year. I want to leave you on one quote before I end. The future isn't cast into one inevitable course. On the contrary, we could cause the 6th great mass extinction in Earth's history, or we could create a prosperous civilization sustainable over the long haul. Either is possible, starting from now. You see, in Just Stop Oil, we're not just fighting to stop all new oil and gas. We're fighting for homes to be more comfortable to live in if they have insulation. We're fighting for transport to be cheaper. We're fighting for the air we breathe to be cleaner. We're fighting for a better world. And if that's not worth putting your time, putting your money, putting your body on the line for, then I don't know what is. We're fighting for survival. And I hope that that can get the necessary coverage that it needs. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Alex. We really appreciate you doing the research and sharing it with us. And we also know that it's tough having to look at all of that and to say all of it. I'm going to hand over now to Graham, who is one of our spokespeople, and he was also a scientist who had a long career as a principal scientist working for Shell. So we're going to hear his perspective on the current situation.
Hello, everyone. So I've got a PhD in engineering, and I joined Shell. I worked there for over 30 years, and I'm now retired, and I've got 3 children. So I worked in most areas of the business, from the upstream to the downstream. I worked all over it. It's what things you do when you're in research and development. I was a principal scientist. I worked with government departments in that time, in the UK, in the US, in Europe. I worked with chief scientists for the government. I also worked with senior members of the board, including the 2 CEOs and a company chair. And half of my career, 15 years, was spent on technology for what we would now call the transition out of oil and gas. But when I joined Shell, it was a company talking about change. And when I left, it was still just a company talking about change. There was no change. Shell will not change. The oil industry will not change. The oil and gas is not part of our solution. And I think we have to recognize this. And we are told by the oil and gas companies that they are about making the transition on our behalf, that we can trust them to do it. We cannot. The oil and gas companies have been kicking the can down the road for at least 30 years, saying, don't worry, the technology is there, you can carry on your lives as normal, we'll sort it all out for you. But while they've been making these statements, the climate catastrophe has been rushing towards us, and now we have this very small window when we can act. Now, oil and gas companies, of which, of course, Shell was a major part in the UK, they lobby government about what they call green growth. They lobby strongly for the continuation of a business as usual position, because anything else threatens their income, threatens their business model. So that's how they work. They work to slow down the transition. And that's why Just Stop Oil is doing the right thing. We are living the position the oil companies take is a fantasy about how we can move out of oil and gas, and our governments buy that message. There's a reason why Shell has its offices so close to Westminster in London. It's so that they can go and talk to them all the time. It's where the scenario team is, Shell's scenario team, and they tell this message that it's all okay. Just leave it to the technology. We'll get it all done. You don't have to worry. And the governments have bought that. And that's why I am in Just Stop Oil now. I'm there. I am here because I've made more change. I feel I've been more useful in Just Stop Oil since I joined earlier this year, last year, than I have in 30 years of working for Shell. I remember one point I worked with the Department of Energy and Climate Change on a large project they had, by which time I was completely rogue within the business. And I gave a talk on their behalf in the Palace of Westminster. And so I was, what we were doing with DEC, what I was doing with DEC, we were looking at all the levers we had to pull to be able to deal with the climate crisis. And about 70 different things we said, we have to work on all of them. We have to do all of them if we're going to address this. And someone stood up in 2015 and he said, it's already too late. Already too late. And that's what, 7 years since I gave that talk. And where are we? We have not made any difference yet. There is no point having polite conversations. We have to do what we're doing. And you, journalists, you need to be on the right side of history, because you will be judged for what you say now, as I will be judged for working for an oil company for 30 years and achieving, well, essentially nothing. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Yeah, so we've now got Oliver. Oliver takes part in Action, was recently one of the SO9, who you may have heard the judge saying kind words about, but then also fining them. He's a student and he's in Manchester, and Oliver's going to take us back in time. Go for it, Oliver.
Thank you, Talia. So I'd like to invite you all to cast your mind back to a little over 30 years before I was born. The year is 1969, and police have just been summoned to a little pub called the Stonewall Inn. Police, who were just doing their job, raided the pub as was protocol. They came up against quite uncalled for levels of hostility. There was yelling, mocking, and jeering directed at the hard-working police. This must have made the police officers' already very difficult jobs much harder. The raid took longer as a result, wasting valuable police time. I feel for anyone who might have, for example, been being burgled at knife point and police couldn't get to them in time because of the disruption caused by this gaggle of gays. The Supreme Court had, 11 years earlier, found that freedom of speech rights protected those selling gay magazines. It would have therefore been perfectly legal if, as the Stonewall Inn was being raided, its customers had set up a table outside and given out leaflets to the passers-by. Perhaps they could have put up a poster or two. If they had taken this approach, then they undoubtedly would have won over many passers-by through persuasion, education, and honest conversation. Of course, this is not what happened. Instead, the situation escalated with bins, bottles, rocks, and even bricks being thrown into the Stonewall Inn. Of course, to any passers-by, this would have been incredibly off-putting. It is easy to imagine a heterosexual, upon seeing the rioting, actually becoming more homophobic. It would have only confirmed their prejudice that LGBT people are vicious, nasty, and like throwing stuff. A real low point was when a parking meter was uprooted and used as a battering ram. I'd say this is the point when the riot stepped into unacceptable public disruption. Ordinary people simply trying to park their cars to get to work couldn't because the parking machine had been removed. They wouldn't have been able to buy a ticket, so might have ended up being given a fine by a traffic warden. Angry homos flooded the streets, causing chaos and confusion. Cars wouldn't have been able to get through because of the sea of screeching queers. There is no way of knowing whether someone could have been having a stroke in their car or been late to their mother's funeral because of the riots. I don't want to be unduly negative, though. Some aspects of the riots and the response to them was very positive. For example, the media provided a robust response. I'd particularly like to highlight the thorough reporting of journalists Howard Smith and Lucian Truscott, who highlighted that the riots were dangerous and ridiculed the forces of faggotry. It is fair to say the media and public would have been much more positive if the queer rioters had instead used more moderate tactics. It's impossible to discuss the Stonewall riots without mentioning Marsha P. Johnson, a Black transgender drag queen and activist. Marsha sought to raise awareness of LGBT rights, but instead of, say, running for election, she threw bricks. I find it particularly ironic, given that there was just a year and 4 months until US congressional elections, the perfect amount of time to run an election campaign. As a political candidate, she'd definitely have gotten my vote, but as a rioter, I can't condone her actions. The real tragedy is that if she had run for election, she could easily and democratically have achieved LGBT legal equality within a 120-year period. The Stonewall riots are often hailed as catalysing the LGBT rights movement. They are the namesake of a charity founded by Gandalf himself, Sir Ian McKellen. But in reality, they are the perfect example of, to quote Priti Patel's tweet from last Friday, the disruptive law-breaking minority riding roughshod over the silent, law-abiding majority.
Thank you, Oliver. Okay, so that was just a rather different sideways look on things. We're now going to go over to Phoebe, and Phoebe is going to respond to one of the questions that we are very often asked, which is, why do you do what you do? Why don't you just sign petitions? Maybe have a political party or change your own lifestyles and the lifestyles of other people. That will get you more people and make more change. So what's your response, Phoebe?
Hi, I'm Phoebe. I'm 21 and I'm a social anthropology student from London, though you may recognise me as one of the soup throwers. And I've taken action with Just Stop Oil 7 other times, including targeting petrol stations, roadblocks and the M25 actions, following which I spent 28 days on remand at H&P Bronzefield. So now you've heard the realities of how bad things really are with the climate science. All of you on this call should know that already, though. You're journalists. You have a responsibility to know the truth. And the truth is, we're heading for a terrifying future. And the truth is, nobody's coming to save us. So we have a moral duty at this time to step up into civil resistance and all do what we can to fight a government whose inaction on the climate crisis is criminal. Now I'm supposed to talk to you about why civil resistance is effective. Normally, when we give this talk and I talk about the social science behind civil resistance, I'm trying to give people a bit of hope after hearing the climate science and realizing how bad things really are. I explain why we use civil resistance, give historic examples of civil resistance being effective, and talk about my own experiences of arrest to demystify it and reassure people it's not as daunting as they might believe. And I invite them to take part in civil resistance, because that's where the hope is. The hope lies there, because just as we must listen to the climate science, we are also compelled to act on the social science, all of which points to civil resistance being the only hope we have to get the radical change we need in the timescale we have left. But I find myself needing to approach you as journalists differently. You're educated. Surely you know that we are using the same tactics of non-violent direct action that were used by the suffragettes, the civil rights movement, the queer liberation movement, and groups that have toppled dictators like Otpor in Serbia. And I'm really bored of being asked if these methods are effective when change is happening, when every major political party, other than the criminal Conservatives, has adopted our demand of no new oil and gas, when major banks, HSBC, Lloyds and NatWest have all pledged to stop investing in new fossil fuels. And I'm bored of being asked if we're bringing people on side, when after our November actions, the equivalent of 1.7 million more people supported the aims of Friends of the Earth, a more moderate climate group. So I'm going to try something different. I want to walk you through why I engage in civil resistance rather than just stop oil as a group. It's quite simple, really. It's because of how I feel about the climate crisis. Maybe I'm assuming the climate crisis makes you feel the same way I do. But that's only because once you allow yourself to open up emotionally, I don't know how you can feel any different. How can you not be terrified of a future of massive food shortages? How can you not be terrified to lose your home to a wildfire, as 60 families did this summer when the UK hit 40 degrees? How can you not be terrified of the breakdown of law and order that hundreds of lawyers predict we will see at 1.5 degrees of warming, which, as you've heard, we are already locked in for? How can you not be in mourning for the millions in the global south who are dying as a result of the climate crisis? For the countless species of plant and animal that are becoming extinct? For the children born today who are being denied a future? How can you not be furious that instead of insulating British homes, the government is insulating billionaires' pockets? How can you not be furious that the government refuses to listen to the advice and warnings of their very own scientists? How can you not be furious that it's been left to ordinary people like us to demand they act on the science? Ever since I sat in a talk similar to this and heard the climate science, there's been a hum of anxiety in my ears that never goes away, except when I'm taking action. Every time I'm locked in the police cells, I get this strange sense of peace wash over me, because I know I'm not a bystander, because I couldn't live with myself if I knew I'd sat back and watched the destruction of everything I know and love. There's huge power in civil resistance, and I would invite anyone who feels that grief, rage, and fear to join us, because we turn fear into hope of a better world, we turn rage into courage, and we turn grief into love. But although I do urge you to join us, I urge you to feel the hope and power that comes with taking direct action. I think you will have the possibility for even greater power, because there's another reason why we use civil resistance. Because otherwise, most journalists wouldn't report on the climate crisis? Why do you not report on it as the crisis it is? Like you did with COVID, making headlines every day. Why has it been left to us to make the greatest threat to human life newsworthy? Why, and when we make headlines, why do you ask us in interviews about our tactics and popularity? Why do you interview us at all? I'm not a climate scientist. I'm not an expert. You know, we live in this insane world where all the experts are being ignored. The United Nations, the International Energy Agency, the IPCC report, all make it perfectly clear that if we want any chance of averting climate catastrophe, we must stop issuing new oil and gas licenses. So it's been left to ordinary people to sound the alarm bells until the experts are no longer ignored. But you have a hand on the alarm bells, don't you? Imagine if you reported on the climate crisis every day. Imagine if you reminded people daily how many people are dying as a result of the climate crisis. Imagine if you spoke to a climate scientist every day who could explain how bleak the future we're facing is. Imagine if you routinely reminded people that we have the scientific solutions to avoid climate catastrophe. 8 years in reserves to transition to renewables, which I'm sure we've reminded all of you are 9 times cheaper. Insulating British homes, subsidised public transport, taxing big polluters and oil companies. These are no-brainers. So I'm going to invite you all to feel the power and peace that civil resistance gives me, whether that be on the streets with us or using your power as journalists.
Thank you, Phoebe. So we've already heard some powerful spoken words from our spokespeople. I'm now going to hand over to Rachel, as she's someone who, as an academic, knows the power of the written word. Rachel.
Hello, my name is Rachel Bossler. I'm a 27-year-old assistant lecturer from California, living in Essex. Sometimes people start these little bits by talking about when they realized that the climate crisis was a big deal. But I'm from Southern California. I grew up in the climate crisis. We'd get really long droughts followed by torrential downpours that would result in flooding and eventually mudslides that would take out cars and houses. As for the wildfires, California is really well known for. We used to have to evacuate every 5 years or so. Then it became every other year. And eventually the fires just became a regular season. My final week of high school was actually cancelled because there were so many fires burning that the air quality was too low to go outside. So knowing how bad it was, I still assumed that the world was rational and democratic and that someone somewhere else would solve it. When I moved to the UK, though, I still would sign petitions or go to the odd march whenever it didn't clash with my social life. But even as it became quite clear that the world was not the grand, rational, ever-improving paradise I thought it was, there was still something stopping me from getting a bit more involved with activism. So I think it's part of being an academic, but I'm sure you'll feel similarly as journalists. I have this tendency towards critique. My friends and I would just sit around saying things like, we definitely support the cause, but the activists should have blocked this building, not that one. They should have damaged property instead of throwing paint. What's up with all the weird costumes and the skulls? Trying to pinpoint every single little imperfection. But when I first heard about Just Stop Oil, I suspended my critique just long enough to attend a talk like this, and something when someone said there really resonated with me. She said that we're not perfect, and nor are we trying to be, but we are learning as we go, and we're really willing to be wrong because we have to know that we did everything that we possibly could. And hearing this helped me to realize that I was just hiding behind my words of criticism to cover up for the fact that I was really scared. Scared of being arrested, of having people stare at me, of having my face blown up on the front page of the paper, of what my friends and family would say. But most of all, I was scared of giving it everything and still failing. And now I'd say I'm not a really brave person. I'm a massive fan of really fearless Hunter S. Thompson types. But the truth is, I'm much more comfortable with my books and writing about things where I can fit everything into a nice, coherent narrative and tie it all up with a bow. Doing things on the ground is far too messy and imperfect, but I'm a determined person. And after this talk, I knew I needed to take some more responsibility and do something, as I'm in a country whose policies are murderous. And that's the thing that really, really upsets me. This government are still hell-bent on continuing to drill for oil, knowing what that means for people in the global south who've already grown up impoverished as a result of colonial and imperial histories. So as someone who lives here, I'm able to put my body on the line to challenge these policies from going through. So I did it. I've been on 5 actions with Just Stop Oil, and I'm more proud of taking action to the point of arrest than I am of getting a distinction in my master's from LSE, or of getting into a PhD program, or of getting an academic job. Even though all those things are really hard, and I'm still really scared. I have my first court cases next month, and I don't know what will happen when I try to renew my visa at the end of this year. This has been my home for 8 years, and I'm scared of losing it. But I'm at peace with everything I've done because it's been in solidarity with those who have already lost their homes, and I know it's been the right thing. So, as Phoebe said, we think everyone should be up on the streets, but we do all have a role to play in this, and journalists have a lot of power too. There is a lot of power to the written word. So I just really want to encourage everyone here to think about how they can most make a difference and what fears are standing in the way of doing more, and try to really, really confront those fears.
Thank you, Rachel. So I wasn't in your conversations earlier when you went out into breakout rooms, when you were thinking about the role of the media and how it reports on the climate crisis. And I will be really interested to hear back from people later to hear what your thoughts were. But for now, we wanted to show you a little video. It's just 4 and a bit minutes long. And we wonder if you can distinguish the fact from the fiction in the video.
This Just Stop Oil slogan is very playgroundish, isn't it? It's just stop oil. I mean, come on, there's more to say than that, isn't there?
I would say that the answers are actually very simple. We need to stop new oil licensing, and that's all we're asking. I wonder if any of you have read the latest IPCC reports that have come out this year. Yeah. You know, what they have said is that we are on the road for climate catastrophe. We are on the road for 3 degrees of warming. This will happen to my generation, to your children's generation, potentially to your grandchildren. And I think we have a moral responsibility to act now. We could set the way for the whole planet by committing to stopping oil, moving to energy efficiency, moving to renewables.
We have to get on with our lives. Most people feel they're doing their bit. They are doing the recycling. But it's about ego. As soon as the sun comes out, oh, it's eco-festival time. Let's get on social media. Let's sit down with a placard. Let's advertise to my friends what a great person I am.
Are we not being clear? We're trying to tell you that the entire planet is about to be destroyed.
What's your response? I just can't believe that that's what you're saying. The United Nations are telling us if we get to 1.7 degrees of warming, half of the population will be exposed to climate conditions that are unlivable. We're trying to uphold the science. The science is being ignored. The academics are being ignored.
You know, there's something we do around here. You know, we just keep the bad news light.
Right, it helps the medicine go down.
Everything these Stop Oil protesters wear or buy or eat was delivered or manufactured using oil.
We're talking about crop failure by 2030. We're talking about people in this country right now in fuel poverty because of the prices of oil. And you're talking about the clothes that I'm wearing.
Listen,
but this is so serious. If we want to talk about hypocrisy, look at the government that has pledged for net zero by 2050, but they pledged for net zero by 2050, and now they're looking at opening 42 new oil fields, which will be releasing fossil fuels into the 2050s. That is a death sentence for my generation and for your children.
Okay.
Is she always like that?
Many people will support your aims, but they may be put off by how you're going about it, by causing huge delays on the roads, putting people's lives at jeopardy when they can't get ambulances, when they can't get their loved ones to hospital. Are you worried at all that you're actually putting people off, that you're doing your campaign, your goals, some damage?
But I'm interested to know about these tactics. What evidence do you have that blocking the busiest motorway in the UK, causing endless disruption for tens of thousands of people, is actually achieving anything?
We are now joined by Just Stop Oil campaigner Sam Johnson. Sam, I suppose the first question is, are you a terrorist?
Why the hell are you targeting us and our government, and you're not targeting the countries that actually are the problem here?
So do you think some of these antics are ruining your cause now?
Did you succeed yesterday in achieving your objective? And what was your objective?
Phoebe Plummer, do you think you are taking enough people with you when it comes to the kind of direct protest, whether it's blocking roads or spraying paint on a famous painting?
You know, this isn't a popularity contest. We're making change.
But are you bringing people with you?
Are you bringing people with you? Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really grateful to be here and have this discussion. It needs to happen. But as journalists, are you doing enough? You know, this is the biggest crisis that humanity has ever faced. You make time to report on the sport every day. Why aren't you telling people how bad it's going to get? Why aren't you out on the streets with us? Because I admire your optimism and I admire you telling people that we have to go towards a renewable future. I agree with you. But quite frankly, it's not happening in policy. So civil resistance is the only chance we have left to get the radical change we need in the timescale we have left. To ensure that I have a future, to ensure that millions of people in the global south don't keep dying. 33 million people are displaced in Pakistan right now. And governments are still pushing ahead with these fossil fuel licenses. That is murderous.
Phoebe Plummer, thank you very much for coming on Newsnight.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Not at all.
So, not quite the last word to Phoebe, but thank you very much for everyone who took part in all of those interviews. We are going to ask you what you're thinking and feeling and what you want to say right now. But before we do that, we're just going to have some thoughts from Fiona about the media and about the role that they fulfill, or they could fulfill, in relation to the climate crisis. Fiona.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming, everyone here. It can't be easy being journalists at this time. The news is unremittingly bleak. How on earth do you keep audiences coming back for more? But whatever the pressures, and there are many, everyone here, I'm sure, understands that truth is at the heart of good journalism. And the truth is, humanity is facing its greatest threat ever. I'm a grandma, and I'm a grandma of a beautiful and bright, another one of those bright and beautiful girls. She's 11, and those words that I've just said break my heart. Who is protecting our young people? I'm a retired teacher. I've had a career of commitment to young people, and I'm horrified at our betrayal of the young. No government anywhere in the world is doing enough. And why not? With all that evidence, why are leaders and fossil fuel companies getting away with their inaction, with their genocidal greed? I think one of the reasons is because there's a gap, a huge chasm between the science, the truth, and the people who need to hear it. I'd like to just read a short quote from the American Society of Professional Journalists. Public enlightenment is the forerunner of justice and the foundation of democracy. People rely on journalism for the truth, to enlighten them, but they're not getting it. It's October. I'm in Parliament Square, and actually it's Insulate Britain this time who are sitting in the street. I'm surrounded by police, members of the public, and journalists. I'm doing outreach, explaining to anybody prepared to listen, what's going on. And actually there's loads of support. It was a brilliant day. I get talking to one young man who fesses up that he's a reporter from The Sun. And he gets out his phone and he records me, and I keep rigidly to the climate crisis so that he doesn't catch me off guard, or at least I think I do. And then he says, after quite a few minutes with each other, he confesses to something else. And it's quite extraordinary, because he says, to be honest, I've been sent down here to get hold of some hostile reactions. He said, but I actually haven't found any. And I sort of watched him as he wandered off to look for his hostile reactions. And I thought to myself, well, probably like many of us, he's got a mortgage, he's got a career, but he seems to have forgotten the truth bit in his training, perhaps. But later I see him, and bingo, he's found someone to give him the negative reaction he was looking for. An elderly couple who are giving him a good moan about they don't really understand why we're doing and what's it all about, and why don't we stand for election and all that sort of thing, or get jobs even. But I worm my way into that conversation, and he and I end up getting invited for a cup of tea back with the elderly couple. And he got his story, because the next day there it was in The Sun, 2 lines from me, not on the climate crisis, must have been the only thing I said that wasn't about the climate science, but all their criticisms reported in full, and absolutely nothing to explain the context. So there's the gap between the truth and public enlightenment. And without public enlightenment, where is the pressure on governments to act? Where is my granddaughter's future? Where is that little girl in Pakistan's future? And of course, there's another way that governments can be held to account, and that's journalists holding their feet to the fire. But that just doesn't tend to happen very often, and I'm really not sure why they're allowed to get away with their platitudes and their promises and their attacks on Just Stop Oil. In January, there was one of those cross-party parliamentary committees that are such a good example of how democracy works at its best when they come together. And they did an environmental audit. And one of the recommendations was that we need a national war effort to tackle the climate crisis. And we also need to set a clear deadline for ending new gas and oil. Thrilling, they've joined Just Stop Oil. But imagine that. Imagine if we did put climate crisis on a war footing. When we declared war against Germany, the newspapers back in 1939, the newspapers, the radio, and the Prime Minister all said, we're at war against Germany. And there was no gap between the truth, however awful, and the people. And then people understood the implications, and they were prepared for change. They got their heads around the threat, the huge disruption. Everyone you've heard today is telling the truth, whether it's their personal truth or the scientific truth. And when we're given the chance to talk to you, we tell you the truth and we explain our actions. We do what we do to get into your newspapers, your shows, your podcasts, your magazines. And then what happens? Sometimes it's absolutely great. We get asked about the climate science so we can explain. But there's been a recent study, an analysis of 8,000 climate-related stories in mainstream and alternative media, and they just show how much we are othered. We're either climate hysterics, fear-mongering idiots, or climate terrorists, left-wing extremists, or climate elitists, too posh to understand real people's issues. Yet what we're actually doing is your job. Every one of those interviews is our attempt to fill that gap between the truth and public enlightenment, and also to inspire you to ask better questions when you get the chance of our leaders. Somehow, though, some stories don't get told. Alex mentioned earlier David Nixon, in jail now, this very second, serving his time for disobeying the judge's instructions. And the judge, Silas Reed, wanted to silence him. He told him he couldn't explain why he did what he did. There's a story, isn't there? Somebody not allowed to tell their story. but he refused to be silenced about the climate crisis. How are you covering that story? And how are you dealing with that gap, the silence? There was a decent bloke doing a decent thing, and in doing so, hoping to protect my granddaughter and your children and all of us. What are you doing? So it's not about our methods, is it really? It's about yours.
That's all we have for you today. If you do have any other questions, you want to get in touch, you can use our press email, juststopoilpress@protonmail.com. You can always go on there if you're not already on our mailing list or on our WhatsApp list. Do go on there and ask to be put on, and we'll put you on there.